Hello everyone, this is the finale of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Madara's words were lost on Naruto as he dove backwards, narrowly avoiding getting ensnared by a large white root that had suddenly burst from the ground beneath him. His eyes were wide and slightly panicking as he was forced to duck low as a wooden tentacle tried to wrap around his en. Out of the corner of his eye he could see Madara smirking at him, hovering a safe distance away from the rapidly growing, whatever it was he had released. The name Shinju sounded particularly ominous. As he watched the sky become eclipsed by twining and creeping branches and roots, it really was comparable to some godly tree bursting from the earth to reach towards the heavens. His arms whirred with activity as one deconstructed before reforming into a whirring saw that madly, see the thick wood before it could get too close. The insectoid wings on his back that had managed to reform buzzed madly as his eyes flicked about, searching for any opening in the rapidly closing maze of wood and plant life growing around him. Every touch from his body seemed to melt away at the twining branches, but for every one he destroyed, 5 more seemed to take its place, writhing and contorting about as the blindly sought him out. He gasped in shock as a smaller, thinner wooden root suddenly wrapped around his arm like a whip. Almost instantly the blue glow pervading his body dissipated, leaving him breathless and drained. His eyes only shot open wider as his struggles grew in intensity, realizing that whatever this plant was, it was desperately trying to absorb his chakra. However, for all his struggling, the tree continued to grow and more roots took up the few precious remaining pockets of space left. Another branch snagged his foot and he quickly sawed it away, only to have that arm jerked back as a wooden tentacle around his wrist. He panted furiously, muscles bulging against his various restraints as he felt his vision beginning to blur. The space around him was getting darker and darker as the roots grew over the last few gaps, letting moonlight in. His body felt so weak as he sluggishly wrenched his way out of the Shinju's wooden grip, only to be ensnared twice as strongly moments later. Even through the darkness that was slowly encroaching on his vision, the young blonde managed to catch a final glimpse of Madara's Rinnegan eye, glinting with victory before a last root grew over that too with a shuddering, creaking groan that rang with finality. His struggles grew less powerful, his movements lacking energy as his eyes were beginning to droop dangerously as the last vestiges of his chakra were whittled away. He just felt so tired, closing his eyes and allowing that inviting darkness to swallow him up seemed so comfortable. Naruto's head nodded down, his eyes slowly closing, unconsciousness gently tugging at his awareness. Naruto. Shion panted, her eyes wide and unseeing before she blinked, gulping in air and trying to control her breathing. She had shot out of bed suddenly, her eyes showing an odd kaleidoscope of colors for a brief instant before returning to their normal violet hue. Her white shirt was soaked in sweat and clung to her skin, causing goosebumps to rise up along her delicate, pale arms as the cold night air chilled her. She sat there a moment, clutching worriedly at the collar of her shirt as she glanced about, her breath shallow and irregular, interspersed with slight gulps as she vainly tried to stop her heart from beating out her sea. Since Naruto had left Oni no Kuni, her visions had become few and far between, their land becoming relatively peaceful and quiet without the looming threat of Mirio hanging over them like a storm cloud. However, it was unlike anything Shion had ever felt before in her visions, a deep-seated, inexplicable terror that had surged up inside of her. Her dream seemed vague and out of focus now that she was awake, but what had caused her fear was the terrible red eye hanging in the sky, 9 obsidian tomo swimming through its crimson surface. Priestess. Predictably, Taruho threw open the sliding door to her room a moment later, by her side in a second as he checked her over. The young Miko brushed him off quickly though, composing herself as she absently straightened her hair, missing the gentle tinkling that her bell used to give off, but smiling just a little as she thought about the young man she had given it to. "I am fine, Taruho, there's no need to worry." The attendant seemed unsure for a moment as he took in the young girl's disheveled appearance, but nonetheless bowed his head and left the room. Shion stayed sitting there for a few more minutes, her eyes unnaturally drawn to the bright full moon hanging stoically in the sky. For just a moment she could have sworn it was interposed by that same BI she had witnessed in her dream but shrugged it off, only a slight chill passing down her spine to make her feel ill at ease. Be safe, Naruto, please. Her mumbled words as she lay back down to sleep provided her little comfort though. Gaara, what are you doing? The young crimson-haired man shifted his teal eyes from his stargazing down to the teenager tiredly lifting her body up onto the tiled roof of the inn they were staying at for the night. I couldn't sleep. His quiet voice did little to rouse the girl as she wiped at her eyes, a cute yawn escaping her lips as she slowly clambered up to roof to sit next to him, a little too close for them to be just casual friends. Oh, she didn't need to ask to know why. Gaara didn't often sleep, more from habit than anything else. Growing up while keeping Shukaku at bay, it had become more of a luxury than a necessity, and the russet-haired boy could often go weeks without needing even an hour of shut-eye. The two sat staring up at the star-filled sky for a few quiet moments. It was very clear out in the countryside of Cha no Kuni, and Sasam's tired eyes were drifting between the different constellations she could remember. The moon seems too bright tonight. The orange-haired Fuma clan girl blinked before looking around at her friend in confusion. She had known ever since he rescued her those long years ago in Ta no Kuni that he had the penchant to be mysterious and vague, but she had come to accept that part of him. So much so that when he had finally decided to move on and refused even more of her clan's hospitality, she came with him. He hadn't seemed all that keen to have her along, but later on she realized it was just because he was unused to interaction with people as a whole. You say the weirdest things sometimes, Gaara. The former Jinchuriki said nothing in return, but that was okay. Sasam had grown used to his long, quiet pauses and had long ago stopped expecting answers when instead she could find them in his deep, teal eyes. She loved his eyes. Often they were the only part of his body not covered in his sand armor, the only part that was really him. You don't have to stay up for my sake, Sasam. That only made her smile more. Despite being the silent type she knew Gaara cared, he cared for all the bonds he had made since he left his home. She yawned as she shuffled closer, gently laying her head on his shoulder and smiling. What kind of friend would I be if I let you stay up here all alone? Yet despite those words her eyes fell closed a few minutes later, her breaths becoming slow and regular. Gaara just smiled, a small smile that was more the upturning of the edge of his lips, but it was a true smile. However, that smile vanished as a faint rustling broke the still quiet of the night. His eyes widened in surprise when he looked down to see the thin but strong layer of sand almost permanently covering his body slip away. A moment of concentration and it had returned to its rightful place, but that one moment of wavering was enough to unsettle the former Sunanin. He hadn't had trouble controlling his sand for years, not since the Ichibi had been removed from him by Naruto, so why now? The question plagued him relentlessly. She stared back up at the moon, once again feeling the slight chill down his spine as it stoically stared back at him. His thoughts turned to Naruto as they were sometimes wont to do, and he wondered what his first true friend was doing right now. The sand in his gourd stirred restlessly at the thought, doing nothing to settle his unease. Tsunade-sama, are you okay? Shizune turned worriedly as she hovered about her mentor, a few sake bottles strewn about the booth they were sitting at. The restoration of the damaged section of Konoha had been going slowly, but most of the injured had been dealt with and there were no life-threatening problems to deal with, so Tsunade had given herself a break. Namely, this involved going out to the nearest undamaged bar and drinking until she couldn't feel her toes anymore. However, on her fourth bottle of sake she had paused for a moment, staring down into her saucer quietly. What? Yeah, I'm fine, Shizune, stop being such a mother hen. Tsunade jerked up, the cup in her hand forgotten as she laughed at Shizune's irritated expression. The poor woman had only been trying to help after all. However, her features quickly turned pensive again as she listlessly swirled the clear liquid in the saucer until she couldn't see her reflection in it. Okay, if you're sure. Shizune's tone echoed her own disbelief at the words. She figured Tsunade's recent bad mood had been from seeing Naruto and Fu again after all this time, only to have them leave without so much as a goodbye. She jerked though when the saucer in her mentor's hand suddenly cracked, breaking into and splashing the older woman with sake, much to the enjoyment of the male patrons of the bar. As Tsunade cursed her misfortune though, Shizune couldn't help but stare at the little saucer, snapped clean in two. It was a very unnatural break and for some reason made her incredibly uneasy. Oh geez, Shizune, stop looking at the damn cup and get me a napkin or something. You stare like that any longer and you'll remind me of Sarutobi-sensei with all his bad omen nonsense. The younger woman was snapped out her daze and quickly moved to comply with her Shishu's request. However, she couldn't help but look back at the broken saucer, wondering why a chill had passed down her spine. Chukaku coughed into his hand, his brow furrowing in exasperation as once again he was forced out of his meditation on the whims of his feeble body. A sigh escaped his lips as he pulled his tired bones out of his cross-legged stance before cracking his N. He was just becoming too old for all this, and it had begun to show with this recent cough he had picked up and couldn't get rid of. Chiraku had urged him to get it seen to, but he had shaken the man off. If it was his time, then it was his time. No use making some big fuss about it or drawing it out. He sighed though, knowing it wasn't quite true. He would like to see Naruto again if he could just hold out for that long. It was a selfish wish, but the old sentimental side of him would like to see the young boy that had considerably brightened up the temple with his mere presence. Still, he knew there was no use worrying over the thought, so he just smoothed out his robes and walked back over to the tatami mat he enjoyed meditating on the most. It was the spongiest. However, a frown marred his usually serene features when he noticed a small tear in the corner of the old mat, allowing another sight to escape his mouth as he shook his head. The temple was old, older than he was, and it too was beginning to show. That thought though elicited a small smile from the old monk as he fondly rubbed a hand along a wooden beam. Gracefully growing old together, eh? He chuckled, but it quickly descended into a small fit of coughs that had him holding onto the same beam for support until it subsided. Well, maybe not so gracefully in my case. He let out a long breath, glancing up at the darkened sky he could see from his window. The moon was big and full tonight, normally excellent conditions for meditation and relaxation. All the same, Chukaku just couldn't get into it. Something was just off. Sora allowed his head to flop back onto the cool ground with a welcome sigh, smiling lightly as he let his body be warmed by the invitingly crackling fire he had set up. The small clearing he had found was beautiful, with a clear little stream bubbling away to the side and dense patches of multicolored flowers strewn about in methodical chaos. He never once regretted his decision to travel away from the temple for a while. Already he had gotten to see sights he could have only ever dreamed of living with the monks. Just like his namesake, the sky was really the limit for him right now. So why did he feel so uneasy right now? For a few hours now, as he went about setting up his camp and just generally relaxing, the strangest chill had worked its way into him. It was a warm night and the fire was lighting up the small clearing well, so he had trouble understanding where this unsettling feeling was coming from. He tried to put it out of his mind and thought instead about what he had seen on his travels, his hand naturally snaking up to fiddle with his Magatama earring as he often did when idle. Ah, damn it. He cursed lightly as the fragile ring that secured the small white bead to his ear snapped, immediately making his scrabble about in the grass until he found it. When he did, his eyes widened slightly, forcing him to hold it closer to the fire just to be sure of what he was seeing. Sure enough, as he turned the little white bead, he saw a tiny crack snake its way from the point all the way up the earring. A frown crossed the monk's face as his thoughts went to the one who had given him this as a gift, not exactly liking the bad omen it represented. Sagiri watched, entranced, as Shizuka flowed through movement after graceful movement of her latest kata. Her glossy black hair shimmered with each step and thrust in the light of the full moon bathing the training ground. He felt so privileged to be able to sit here and watch this epitome of grace and poise just move, even if they were in practiced movements designed to fight with. Naturally, his eyes were drawn to a single bead of sweat that percolated on her forehead, watching it trace the gentle curves of her face, down the taut slope of her N where it rounded the swell of her bosom before finally disappearing into the alluring S of her cleavage. Like what you see, Sagiri-kun. The boy's head shot up like lightning, a bright red blush spreading rapidly over the bridge of his nose as he desperately avoided looking into his girlfriend's mirth-filled emerald eyes. She had just finished her set, ending with implanting a few shuriken in a nearby tree in the vague pattern of a flower, only to glance up and see her boyfriend's wandering gaze. It was so fun to rile the poor merchant up, especially when he lacked the emotional training all Nadeshiko Kanoiki went through. I'll get those for you, Shizuka-chan. In a poorly concealed attempt to avoid looking at her, the boy quickly hurried over to the shuriken implanted in the tree, taking them out one by one. He jumped then when he felt a hand lightly caress his N, turning with a more brilliant blush to see Shizuka right behind him, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Gently she took the shuriken Sagiri had in his hand, Just enjoying the fact that she could share this time with him, it reminded her to thank Naruto the next time she saw him. Ah! Sagiri pulled his hand back, a bead of red welling up on his fingertip from where the shuriken, that had inexplicably shattered into two between the grip, had seen into him. Shizuka just raised a brow. She hadn't thrown the shuriken nearly hard enough to leave them this brittle, and they were only a few days old. Oh, come here, Sagiri-kun, let me help you with that. Never one to let an opportunity drop, though. Shizuka quickly took the merchant's finger from where he was cradling it and leading it up to her mouth, where, after only a moment to smirk mysteriously at her lover, she placed it between her lips, sucking slowly. As Sagiri, now properly motivated by the entrancing display, led the giggling Kunoichi from the training ground, she spared another fleeting glance to the shuriken laying abandoned on the grass. A single bead of crimson bee lay on the cold steel, catching the reflection of the moon, but it a sickly, unnatural scarlet. It went quickly forgotten, though, as the young woman turned her attention back towards the man she loved, only existing as a slight chill that only briefly passed down her spine. Nezumiro cracked her back softly as she finally made it up the slope, silently complaining about where Naruto had to place Shizuku's grave. However, soon enough the beautiful statue he had made of the girl came into sight, making the amber-haired girl smile thoughtfully. Gently she placed the flowers she had collected down in front of the statue, her eyes following where the droplets of water actually seemed to leak down the girl's stony form. Sometimes when visiting the grave she had to remind herself that it was just a statue. It often seemed so lifelike she would forget this wasn't actually Shizuku for a while. Today, though she wasn't sure, the statue seemed dulled. It was the only way she could describe it. It was as though it had lost some of the spark, the life that had made it so beautiful. After a moment or two of contemplation, the Kirigakure Kunoichi shrugged absently. Maybe it was just the way the bright full moon hung overhead that seemed to bleach the statue of color, leaving it pallid and washed out. Hey Shizuku-chan, it's a really pretty night, so I thought we could talk. Nezumiro grinned brightly as she sat down so she could lean against the base of the memorial, her legs pulled up tight against her seat. Auntie May was really grouchy today. I think it's because of Ao again, you know how he is. She wasn't sure how long she stayed out there, at least until the moon had inched further across the sky and dew had begun to collect on the grass. Some might have called her crazy for coming up to this desolate hill in the middle of nowhere and talking about inane things with a statue, but she enjoyed it. It gave her the opportunity to just talk and think without interruption. Not to mention Shizuku, Fu, and Naruto had saved her life, and she felt she owed the girl who had given her life in her country's struggle for freedom. She always made sure to come up once at least every 2 weeks, to pay her respects if nothing else. Despite the statue always looking immaculate and never seeming to need any repair or maintenance, she didn't want the memorial to simply go forgotten. However, as the mists began to draw in for the inevitable morning fogs that plagues Mizu no Kuni, Nezumiro made her bright goodbye. She darted off from the statue, never noticing the condensation that built up around its sparkling stone eye, slowly sliding down its face like a single solitary tear. Hiruzen just knew his face must have gained a few years in the last couple days alone as he stood in front of the large panoramic window overlooking his battered, but surviving village. One of his arms was in a sling and he had bandages crisscrossing his stomach, but his injuries were nothing he hadn't experienced through the 3 wars he had fought in or presided over. The wrinkles on his face seemed deeper and his eyes were a little more sunken than usual, but most of all he felt tired, just exhausted. Watching as his village recovered yet again from attack, he realized just how old he was. Too long he had deceived himself that if Unoki could stay strong in his old age, then why not him? The truth was he shouldn't even be standing here. He had long ago been ready to retire, give up the hat and live out the rest of his life in relative peace with his remaining family. And yet, as he stood there, looking over the village he had helped shape and mold in his 60-plus years, he had no successor. His students, brilliant as they were in their own regards, had no intention of taking the mantle. The next generation was still too young even if they showed promise, and the current generation of Junin just couldn't stand up to their predecessors in terms of power or ability, even if Kakashi came close. He sighed wearily, sinking into his comfortable chair and placing his fingers on the bridge of his nose. He often wondered how different things would be if Naruto had simply stayed in the village. In a few years he might have been ready to take up the Hokage himself. He certainly showed the power for it if his ANBU's reports of the fight with the Akatsuki leader were anything to go on. Yet, At the same time, he couldn't help but feel ashamed about how happy Naruto seemed when he wasn't in the village, or when he was alone with that girl. What did that say about his treatment within the village for the short time he lived there? Another long-winded sigh escaped him as he looked towards the Hokage monument, always within view, so that it seemed like the past Hokage were always watching over him, measuring what he did. In particular, he stared up at the Yondaim's face, wondering just how much he had failed his legacy. It had sustained a little damage in the fight with the Akatsuki, a few new cracks spidering out over his handsome stony features. Despite what his students might say, Sarutobi was hardly a superstitious man, yet as he looked up at that firm, stoic face carved into the mountainside, he felt a brief chill pass through his bones. Tayuya nearly spat out her drink, laughing raucously as Haku grinned, holding up a little ice sculpture of Honoka. The girl in question just huffed with slightly over-exaggerated irritation, crossing her arms under her sea and pouting. She wouldn't have minded normally. Haku's sculptures were often incredibly good, capturing the likeness of whatever it was he was copying down to the freckles. It was more the fact the little ice statue had her stood atop a pile of workmen, a whip in hand as she pointed somewhere in the distance. A few of the aforementioned workers caught sight of the little spectacle between the three teens and began laughing as well, quickly spreading to the entirety of the bar. Slowly the red-headed Uzumaki girl sank into her shirt, wanting to disappear as she was made the laughingstock of the entire room. Haku simply dissolved the statue and patted her on the back fondly, holding down his own chuckles. Honoka simply smirked evilly beneath the collar of her shirt. The ice boy would get his later. Never let it be said, and Uzumaki backed down in the face of pranking. Damn, I'm glad this was one of the first places they fixed up. Tayuya's slightly drunken tone washed over the three as she tipped back another saucer of sake, much to Haku's growing worry. Tayuya was usually quite a bit to handle without her being drunk, although he had to at least agree with her sentiment. The bar was a warm and lively place in comparison to the normally quiet and lonely ruins that otherwise occupied Azu no Kuni. Later on, figuring Tayuya had probably had enough, he bid Honoka farewell as he carried the other Uzumaki girl home on his back, trying not to wince as she sang to herself in her moderately tone-deaf slur, quite loudly. They passed a few workmen on the path back and Haku nodded politely, even as Tayuya jeered quite merrily. The workmen had been a rather recent addition to the island, simply showing up one day around a few weeks ago for a reconstruction job. Apparently someone had hired nearly the entire island of Nami no Kuni for the reconstruction of Azushiogakur. When asked how they were supposed to pay for such an undertaking, a kindly but often drunken old man called Tazuna had told them it was all paid for by an anonymous donor. Haku instantly figured out who exactly had paid for it all, and at the time he had been rather disbelieving the young monk could possess such money. However, belief or not, the job had been taken, and ever since the Nami countrymen had been there to stay, and slowly but surely Azushio was being restored to a semblance of its former glory. They didn't say anything, but Haku had a suspicion Honoka and Tayuya secretly hoped that as word spread about the rebuilding, the spread out Uzumaki clan might once again come together in one home. It often amazed him how much family meant to those two once they realized they actually had some. Walking into one of the apartment blocks that had been set up as temporary living accommodation until more substantial housing could be built, he quickly unlocked his door, or at least attempted to, as a giggling Tayuya constantly batted away his hand, seeing as some kind of game. All the same, he eventually managed to make it inside before throwing Tayuya onto the bed, much to the girl's drunken joy. He ignored her sloppy, seductive calls from the bed as he got ready for the night, quietly smiling to himself from amusement. His girlfriend was a funny drunk. However, as he walked back into the bedroom, he noticed something off. Along the windowsill that he could clearly see the bright, full moon out of, were a row of small, immaculate ice sculptures. They were of each of his friends, including Fu and Naruto, the last two intended to be presents when the two finally returned to Azushio. However, the figure of Naruto was cracked clean in half, a pool of melted water collecting around the two fragments. For a moment he wondered if Tayuya had knocked it over, but the girl had passed out in a rather undignified manner on the bed. It was easily fixable and shouldn't have really been a concern, but his eyes were drawn to the fact that with the way the figure seemed to be melting, it looked as though Naruto was crying. He tried to shake it off as he shifted Tayuya into a position that would actually allow him to get onto the bed, but try as he might, he couldn't rid himself of the uneasy, unsettling feeling that came over him. The world around Naruto was dark and cold. like he had fallen beneath some frozen lake. His body was sluggish, unresponsive and so very weak, it felt as though freezing iron chains held down his limbs. With every breath he heard his heart beat loudly in his ears, slowly getting slower and slower like some petering lullaby allowing him to drift away. Where to he couldn't say, but right now, anywhere else seemed inviting and warm compared to this dark, freezing void he was trapped in. Oh! His breath quickened as he felt a gentle tug on his shoulder, his heart jumping in shock as it seemed to pull him back. He wanted to lean into the touch, but his body was so heavy, so cold that he just couldn't. He felt the warmth linger for a moment before that too disappeared, leaving him all alone again. Uto, he felt it again, a tiny bit of warmth latching onto his shoulder that he desperately tried to latch onto, frantically hoping that it would stay like a ray of light amidst a darkened storm. However, soon it slipped away like the last time, like some cruel taunt placed in front of him that his weighed-down body would never be able to reach. Naruto. Again, he struggled, forcing his tired, aching body to turn, to do something so that the warmth wouldn't leave him. He couldn't take it again. A low, exerting grunt escaped him as he fought against his restraints with everything he had left. It wasn't enough though, it was like the weight of the entire world sat on his shoulders, it was just insurmountable. Naruto, if his head could have snapped up it would have, as it was a pair of dim-lidded Rinnegan eyes managed to open, just a crack. Naruto, it's okay, you're not alone. Even this much was tough, but gradually he battled through it, opening his eyes, desperate to see who was talking, desperate to know who that warm, soft voice belonged to. It was so filled with warmth and compassion Naruto felt like the void was being pushed away by its mere presence. He had to know, had to. You were never alone. Naruto froze, his eyes fuzzy and half-lidded as he craned his N against the roots securing him in place. He could barely make out a blur of long red hair before he blinked it away, the warmth that voice gave him pushing away the dark and the cold. A gentle smile, two bright, vibrant purple eyes, a mane of long, beautiful red hair. Her body was insubstantial, barely even there like a ghost, and behind her there was a tall blonde man, his features strikingly familiar. Naruto couldn't know if it was delirium from chakra exhaustion or just his mind going insane, but as he saw those two smiling softly at him, their eyes filled with pride, he saw others begin to appear behind them. Fu, Tayuya, Haku, Shizuku, Nagato, Konan, Sora, Shizuka, Nezumihiro, Chukaku, Chiraku, Sarutobi, Ayami, Tuki, everyone who had touched his life was standing there like wispy wraiths, smiling and urging him on with silent words. Another jolt of warmth ran through his body, filling him with energy he hadn't realized he even had, and when he struggled to turn his head again he saw the Bayu, standing on his other side, their own eyes filled with determination. Kurama had laid a single great paw on his back, where the warmth seemed to be coming from. His breaths came out stronger as his eyes narrowed, the ground beneath his feet cratering as with a great cry of exertion he pushed. The roots seemed to writhe at his activity, but he didn't care. Even as they grabbed at his limbs and wrapped around his end, he just pushed harder. More arms burst from his shoulders, pushing with him like the helping hand of comrades. His arms started to vibrate from the exertion, but even as he felt the muscles strain and begin to burn, he carried on, the people behind him slowly vanishing one by one until just those two remained, standing on either side, hands on his shoulders. We know you can do it, Naruto. We know you can do anything. The blonde's teeth clenched together as he roared out his pain and frustration, pushing with everything he had, with the strength he had been given. Shinra, he never noticed a cloak of pure white chakra with the consistency of a flame seemed to materialize out of the air to alight around his shoulders, a brilliant snowy howry that billowed out around him in an unseen wind. His eyes glowed brilliantly, 9 Tomo spinning excitedly along their rings as he poured in every last ounce of energy he could feel in his body. 10. Say. Then everything went white. Madara floated far away from the Shinju, watching with mild curiosity as the strange, almost vine-like construction of the supposed god tree finished twining together with a final shuddering groan of wood. His eyes moved up to the top of the branchless tree where a large flower looked ready to bloom, a victorious smile passing over his features. He didn't really care if this over-glorified plant really was some kind of god. He was an Uchiha, he would harness its power regardless. No, what was important here was the fact that after decades of scheming, lying in the shadows out of sight of that damn Hashirama and his successes, his victory was finally upon him. The other Rinnegan user was dealt with, not that he ever stood a chance, not to mention the irritating Jinchuriki was trapped somewhere beneath the 10 Tails true body. His chakra would be absorbed and the god tree would be fully restored without the need for all of Obito's silly little modifications. The boy was talented and his Mangekyo was useful for sure, but he lacked the raw power needed to fully see his vision through. At that thought Madara frowned lightly, his eye morphing into its Sharingan form as it scanned the battlefield in search of his apprentice's body. He would be needing his other eye when. Responding to the sudden change, Madara's eye automatically flicked over the Shinju as the entire tree suddenly shook with a tremendous force. Entire roots, longer than many villages were wide, were held from the ground and the Shinju itself swayed. He couldn't see it, but the eye nestled in that flower high above him widened in fear and shock as its petals shuddered with the unnatural force. It calmed moments later, but it left the Uchiha patriarch rather perturbed. Finally, though, he put it up to the last futile struggles of a worthy adversary and left to look for his wayward pupil and his missing eye. A different set of Rinnegan eyes slowly opened to a very different scene as Naruto blearily stood up, or at least he thought he was standing. Wherever he was didn't seem to have a discernible floor. It just appeared to be a long, endless white void with no up or down, no ground or sky, and not even a visible light source, although he could see his own hands just fine. It was all rather disorienting, and when he took a step forward he was fearful he would just slip down into that bottomless nothing and be lost forever, falling, or maybe ascending. I assure you, this is a new experience for myself as well. Naruto whirled at the androgynous, monotone voice, his eyes wide and surprised. It had sounded as though it was right next to his ear. However, when he turned there was nobody there, further confusing him and causing him to slowly grow more frustrated. He took a breath, calming himself, and sat down on the non-existent floor in a simple cross-legged position and focused on the flow of his chakra. It was the only thing in this white hell that was familiar and comfortable. Our meditation. He was fond of that strange human practice also. Naruto opened his eyes but was once again met by nothing but the empty space before him, no owner of the voice to be found. Then again, I find a great deal of what your race does to be strange. I suppose that is our differing natures. Naruto gently attempted to tap into the natural energy around him, hoping it would at least give him an inkling of where he was. However, as soon as he stilled his body, it was like opening the floodgates to an entire ocean. The area around him was completely swathed in natural energy. It blanketed this world like it was the air and the ground. What do you think you are doing? The voice still held a steady, monotonous quality, but Naruto could feel the sheer hostility in those words as he desperately stemmed the flow of the senjutsu to his body before he was overwhelmed and consumed. Sorry. It came out on instinct as Naruto finally calmed the tumultuous energies within himself, letting the natural energy flow out of his body and back into this oddity of a world. Ah, so the human can speak, that is refreshing. Naruto sighed, knowing that wherever he was, meditation wasn't going to help him, nor deal with this voice that seemed to be speaking more within his head than actually to him. It is disconcerting to hold a conversation with nothing. Most people consider the behavior unusual. A presence finally made itself known behind the young blonde, but when he turned he found words wouldn't come. He was transfixed, breathless. Ah, but what is unusual? Naruto Uzumaki. Before him stood a goddess. Other words failed to accurately sum up the presence this one woman had. She was tall, but only enough that Naruto had to slightly crane his end to meet her eyes. They themselves were the purest white, almost like the Byakugan, save for where those clan members had the lightest hints of pale colors. She had none, like she had no iris or pupil at all. His skin was equally pale, like a delicate porcelain that belied the rippling power she seemed to effortlessly emanate. Keeping with the pure theme, her hair billowed about her form like a blanket of snow, not a hair out of place even though it nearly reached her feet. In some places it seemed to merge right into the brilliant white cloak she wore, decorated in places by familiar symbols of Magatama and Tomo in vibrant, royal purples. Pale, almost unnoticeable circles decorated the space just above her eyes, not unlike the markings of a sage, while a vertical, S-like line emerged just above the bridge of her nose. To complete the otherworldly look, two great horns rose from her scalp, parting her immaculate hair like a crown of smooth, perfect bone. Who are you? Naruto couldn't control the slight catch in his tea, however he couldn't avert his eyes, or look away at all. This form is Kaguya Otsutsuki, the very first of your kind to partake of my fruit and life. In a way she was my very first Jinchuriki, The first to harness my power that you humans have come to corrupt and defile. At that, the meticulous expression on the woman's face twisted into a slight scowl, the sight of which Naruto could image preceded the destruction of a great deal of land. However, the words struck him as his mind flickered back to the stories Kurama had told him of the original sage when he had first begun to earn the fox's trust. Otsutsuki. As in Hagoromo Otsutsuki. Before his very eyes the visage of the woman shifted, the porcelain skin becoming sun-beaten and wrinkled, the hair losing its luster and becoming grayed while the horns shrank down to more resemble Naruto's forehead protector. Then the eyes opened again and Naruto was facing down a very familiar set of rippled gray orbs as the sage of the six paths hovered in front of him in a cross-legged stance so utterly familiar to him. It was the one Chukaku had taught him all those years ago. There was him as well. He was certainly one of the more interesting of your kind with the way he disseminated my chakra amongst the people, hoping it would connect them together. A slight sneer crossed a face that looked as though it had never bore a negative emotion in its life. He was naive until the end, but he was strong. It was at that point Naruto snapped himself out of his mildly awed state and realized this wasn't actually the sage sitting in front of him, just an image, an echo. You are the Juubi then. The revelation surprised the blonde even as he spoke it. There was certainly no intelligence in the eye of that beast as he battled Madara atop its body. The representation of Hagoromo nodded all the same, a hand coming up to stroke the long, grayed beard. A distasteful and rather unoriginal name, but yes, that is an aspect of myself. More commonly, when I was still anchored in this world, I was known as the Shinju. Naruto blinked, remembering Madara say that very same name, as if it were supposed to be common knowledge. Why take this form then? The image of the sage tilted its head slightly, aged, omnipotent eyes regarding the blonde with something akin to curiosity. I could take any number of forms. Over the millennia hundreds have touched my chakra in one way or another, some housing my fragments. The sage's features shifted once more, suddenly flashing through many different appearances that Naruto didn't recognize until suddenly he saw Gaara's face, only to vanish moments later, replaced by Yugito's, Yagura's, then Roshi's and so on. The Shinju continued to cycle through the Jinchuriki Naruto knew until it paused and Naruto found himself looking into a much more familiar set of violet Rinnegan and bright blonde hair, others housing a closer approximation to my whole. Naruto couldn't help the slight shudder that passed down his spine as he was forced to watch his own face morph into that of Madara Uchiha's. It makes no difference to me, but as the very first I suppose I have an attachment of sorts to Kaguya. You humans might call it sentimentality. Slowly Madara's cruel features melted away and Naruto was once again sitting across from the vision of beauty and power that was Kaguya Otsutsuki, now in a humble Caesar position. So you don't consider it sentimental? Naruto wasn't even sure what he was saying anymore, the conversation had become so surreal, he was talking to the Juubi. Kaguya's eyes regarded him stoically though, a long pause following his statement. A long time ago I suppose I would not have. I was everything, connected to this world and so intrinsically linked that I never truly was. I existed, but I had no idini, no self, just a presence. However, with this woman's acceptance of my power I suddenly was something. I found a sense of self, separated from my whole. At that Naruto had a feeling the Shinju had once considered itself to be the entire world. Although he could only infer. It grew within her son, an individuality that was so alien I initially fought it, refused to accept it. It was only when I was separated, fragmented that I realized what I had lost. Then those fragments gained their own sense of self, they grew further from our original whole, too far. The voice still carried no true emotion but Naruto could almost feel the slight hint of longing lacing the air around him. New feelings I had before had no use for suddenly appeared. Rage that something would take my energy, sadness that it could become tainted and twisted in such a way, fear as I was from myself and imprisoned. Regret that I could not stop it. A long, uncomfortable silence seemed to ripple through the void as Naruto sat there, unknowing of what to say to this Ani. You became more human. The representation looked up, not even a hint of emotion flickering across its face as its blank eyes bored into Naruto's soul for a moment. Yes, I became more human. Naruto was a little surprised it had accepted that so easily, only to feel a tremor of frustration ripple across the world around him. Then what now? Naruto had worked it out by now. Somehow he had been drawn into some shared mind space with the Shinju. In retrospect, he should have realized that if such a thing were possible with the Bayou, then it only made sense for the same to be true of their progenitor. However, he didn't know how he ended up here. Was he S? You are not S. Naruto Uzumaki. The blonde blinked before frowning at the regal woman's impassive form. You're in my head. A slight tilt of the head gave the impression of amusement, but it seemed more of a facsimile, an imitation, than a genuine response. And you are in mine. However, that made the blonde's eyebrow raise slightly. It almost sounded like a joke, but that was impossible. You humans never cease to amaze me by what you decide is or is not impossible. Naruto simply stared at the woman incredulously before narrowing his eyes slightly. So you were making a joke. The Shinju just stared at him evenly, not dignifying that with a response. After a moment or two, Naruto relented, a brief sigh escaping his lips as his posture slumped a little. A second later though, and his gaze was back up, Rinnegan eyes searching Kaguya's face curiously, as if looking for something he expected to be there. Because he certainly couldn't feel it within himself. Where are the Bayou? Where is Kurama? Kaguya's regal visage simply blinked once, letting Naruto know everything he needed to. He looked down, a troubled frown secured firmly on his face. They are not gone, as you might imagine. You humans have such defined notions of what is and isn't. They are simply part of the whole they were once separated from, returned to how they were, chakra. Naruto's frown only deepened, and the Shinju was reminded of the single time Hagoromo Otsutsuki had talked with it, as a much younger man than it chose to represent him as. How is that fair? They had lives, personalities, bonds, and feelings of their own. Is all of that just gone now? Again he was met by that cold, immovable stare as the very first user of chakra regarded him, not curiously, but some approximation of the emotion. Like I stated, you humans rarely understand these things. Are your bonds meaningless when your corporeal form rots away? When that fickle immaterial notion of a soul passes onto the pure world? The fragments of myself may have fooled themselves with the concept that their lack of physical forms granted them an immortality, but they had their lives, as all things will and must. The Shinju saw it had done nothing to ease the concern of the young human sitting before it. However, they are not S. As Naruto looked up, the Juubi caught a flicker of that strange human concept so alien to itself enter his eyes: hope. What did the Shinju have to hope for? It was, is, and will be. Humans were truly an enigma. What do you mean? Naruto didn't understand. If what the Shinju was saying was true, he would never see Kurama again, never get to talk with Matatabi or stroke Shukaku's head. They are me, I am them, I am not S, they live. Naruto blinked slowly and the Shinju nearly, sighed. You once asked me whether or not Bayou really ate, and I told you while the chakra within us needed no sustenance or replenishment, we could still taste. Naruto's frown was slowly beginning to slip away. I asked Kurama that. The Shinju just nodded slowly and Naruto's eyes opened a little wider. The being sitting before him genuinely didn't understand the difference. So what does that make you now, if you are what they have become? The blonde blinked in surprise when the image in front of him smiled mysteriously, betraying that previously stoic facade. I am. We are. At that, Naruto just sighed and scratched the back of his head. It was like trying to talk to Master Chukaku right after he meditated. So what will you do now? The smile slipped away and once again silence reigned over the two for an awkward few seconds. I imagine the one called Madara will wish to return the world to a state this one, Kaguya, also tried to enact, the eternal Tsukuyomi. It is not a terrible state, and not one I am unfamiliar with, even if the self that began that way, is not the self sitting before you. This time Naruto resisted scratching his head as he puzzled out the enigmatic being's unintentionally cryptic words. But what do you want to do? The Shinju regarded him oddly as Naruto felt strange tremors of indiscernible emotions ripple through the blank world. I do not want. I am. At that, Naruto crossed his arms, irritation finally overcoming his confusion as it was his turn to level a penetrating stare at the most powerful being in the world. Kurama wanted freedom. The Shinju raised a deceptively delicate eyebrow at the young, rather brazen boy. I failed to. The eyebrow rose higher as Naruto suddenly raised a hand, see the being off mid-sentence. Shukaku wanted me to scratch behind his ears, Matatabi wanted to talk to someone, Isabu wanted somewhere quiet, Son Goku wanted people to call him by his name, Kokuo wanted to argue with me, Saiken wanted someone that wouldn't fear his touch, Chome wanted to fly and Gyuki wanted a partner. Naruto stood up, his eyes blazing with an unnatural glow as they glared at the delicate form of the Shinju sitting before him. Don't tell me that you do not want, if there is even a scrap of them left within you. If everything that makes you came from them now, as you've just said, then everything that made them who they are now makes you who you are. Even if you do not understand the concept of desiring something, that does not mean you lack such a concept. Another heavy silence fell as slowly the Shinju's form got to its feet in a practiced and graceful manner that belonged to somebody else. You are a curious being, Naruto Uzumaki. Another pause as it scrutinized him, seemingly looking past him at something Naruto couldn't hope to see. Yes, I remember those once, and even now they cause paradoxes within me, the cracks of the fragments joining together again, as it were. All at once I feel the need to separate, to have my individuality return to me, and at the same time I wish nothing more than to become what I was, even though I know that is impossible. Do you humans have a word for this feeling? Despite the emotionless delivery, Naruto couldn't help it as his expression softened slightly. It's called a dream. The Shinju tested the word, as if trying it out, finding it to have a strange quality it couldn't quite figure out. Why would you humans chase what you know to be impossible? Naruto shrugged slowly. I'm not sure, it's just what humans do. It gives our lives purpose and something to hope for, it validates our existence. If we didn't have a dream, then what would be the purpose in our existence? Without dreams, without hopes, our only reason to stay alive would be our fear of death. The Shinju considered his words. This was only the second human it had ever talked to whilst whole, and it was very strange how similar the two seemed to be. It made the old Ani wonder if this was the reincarnation of that very same man that had once imprisoned and divided it. I still do not understand your question then. Why must I want? Before you humans interfered, as you are prone to do, I did not even understand the concept of wanting, yet time continued and the world still prevailed. It was pointless for me to want anything back then. Again Naruto struggled to find an answer, knowing silence at this moment would be of no use. This conversation felt important, immeasurably so, yet he couldn't figure out why. Because like you said, you are not what you used to be, right? The Shinju hummed thoughtfully, obviously a trait it had picked up from one of its many containers, perhaps even Naruto himself. I could return though, what this Madara proposes, it would return the world to how it once was. I would possess my chakra again, rightfully returned from your thieving race. There was a long, tense pause as Naruto genuinely thought the being had made up its mind, or consensus. It was a little confusing. However, that would mean losing this self, and for some reason I find that idea less than ideal. Naruto blinked. It was odd to watch such a powerful, basically omnipotent being have a moment of idini crisis. You don't want to give up the individuality you have gained. The Shinju looked up. Although in reality it was just the visual manifestation, Naruto was probably inside the Shinju, so it couldn't look up. Is that normal? Naruto shrugged again. What was normal? For a human, I suppose so. Everybody wants to be acknowledged. Nobody wants to exist without purpose, and now that you have a self, something that you can actually identify yourself with, you finally can have something you never had before, an idini, a purpose. Even if you don't need one right now, do you want to lose the chance to ever have one? The Shinju said nothing, remaining unmoving as a further silence pervaded the empty world. I suppose that is a point of view. Naruto smiled lightly. Sometimes it was like talking to an impossibly wise and all-knowing being, other times he felt as though he were talking to a child. Then, what do you want? The Shinju let out a long breath, a rather useless action in a world that probably didn't even possess oxygen. I do not know. Naruto shrugged slowly at that. It was a start, at least the Ani wasn't rejecting the concept outright anymore. That's okay, not knowing what you want isn't a bad thing. Many people don't know what they want to do with their lives, and spend it searching for their purpose. For many others that search becomes their purpose, until they find something else. Again, another stare. It was slightly unnerving to be looked at so intensely, knowing that this was actually an unfathomable being of chakra once regarded as a god. Save I am not, people. Naruto shrugged, feeling that the conversation might begin to circle if he wasn't careful. But you can obviously think like one. There it was again, that strange, mysterious smile that seemed off on the face the Shinju chose, yet at the same time perfect. You are an interesting human, Naruto Uzumaki. Now the conversation really was starting to circle. You said that already. The smile never dropped this time as the Shinju slowly descended back into the traditional Caesar position. It managed it much better than Naruto could, considering he much preferred a meditative position than the more formal ways. He supposed that was the years spent observing Kaguya herself through the chakra they had shared. It is no less true than before. Naruto was at a loss again, he could have sworn that that was a joke. The Shinju just continued to smile. I should hate you. Naruto's eyebrow rose curiously, wondering just where that came from, and as if hearing his thoughts, which it likely was, the Shinju elaborated. You are human, you belong to a people that my chakra from me, disseminated it between your unworthy, immature and volatile race and locked me away. Naruto waited with slightly bated breath, but the Shinju didn't continue. But you don't. It was a cautious question, probing more than asking, and the Shinju almost seemed to want to disregard it in him. Shouldn't I? Naruto hadn't been expecting a question in return, and the Shinju never dropped its slight smile as he scrambled for an answer. The blonde may have been able to keep a straight face and his emotions in check, but in this world, their minds interconnected, he was an open book. Can you judge an entire species by the actions of their predecessors? Does a child deserve to suffer because of something its parent or grandparent did? The Shinju's smile never wavered, and it was highly unsettling how accurately it replicated the expression. I do not have to judge your entire species. Your people wage almost constant war, still using my chakra to spill bee and spread hatred using your kind, the Jinchuriki. Your shinobi twist the teachings of my first Jinchuriki's ninju into ninjutsu, use chakra that was supposed to link men and use it instead to K them. Your species has an ability unlike any others to wage war and turn anything into a weapon. Naruto frowned, and for once no answer came to him. This was the same conversation he had with Nagato, and he was no better prepared for it now than he was then. What about the good? It came after a long moment of silence, sounding a little meek as Naruto stared at the non-existent floor. What about all the great things chakra has done for people, like healing them, helping people fly, allowing them to connect to nature? The Shinju only needed to consider the words for a moment. You would defend an entire species with the actions of so few. Naruto violently fought down the urge to shrug. How else was he supposed to defend humanity? Lights shine brighter in the dark. A single immaculate brow rose on Kaguya's face as she gave a long, thoughtful hum. Ah, the human concept of yin and yang, light and dark coexisting to provide contrast and enhance the other. He was also quite fond of the idea. For a long time the Shinju was quiet, not particularly seeming to look at anything. You do realize that the easier path would be to accept this eternal Tsukuyomi. Humanity would gain the peace it so often seems to crave yet never actually lets itself have for long. Naruto smiled easier at that and couldn't help himself as he indulged a habit he hadn't in a few years. My master once told me that the easier paths only exist because a long time ago, somebody was brave enough to step off an easy path and make a new one. Once again Naruto was placed under the harsh scrutiny of the Shinju's stare, and after what felt like minutes, but was likely only a few seconds, it released a small hum. Of approval or disparagement he couldn't be sure, but it finally felt as though some resolution had been found. Interesting, I can see your soul laid bare before me, I know the answers you will make before even you do, and yet you somehow manage to surprise me. Maybe I should apologize for trying to K you. Naruto blinked as the Shinju seemed to say the last part mostly to itself. In the end though it simply shrugged, Kaguya's form somehow making the simply gesture seem like the epitome of elegance. However, the blonde managed to get over his mild shock as he realized what the Juubi had just said. Wait, if you know what I'm going to say before I say it, why bother asking? Another smile crossed Kaguya's beautiful face, and for the briefest moments Naruto saw a hint of Kurama in that smirk. Because it is amusing, of course. Then the Shinju lightly tapped Naruto on the sea, and all he saw was white, again. Madara blinked rapidly, getting used to the feeling of having two eyes again as he tested his vision, morphing into each stage of his dojutsu and back before crossing his arms over his sea with a smug, satisfied smirk. Everything was coming together now, all he had to do was wait for the Shinju to bloom, and decades of waiting would finally be over, he would have his eternal victory in the Tsukuyomi. There weren't even any other shinobi around to try and stop him, the location was far too desolate, it was all perfect. Then that perfection gained a tiny crack as the Shinju swayed slightly. It drew Madara's eye, but he didn't think too much on it. The petals were still parting after all. Then the roots began to convulse, writhing about and actually pulling themselves from the earth. Rinnegan's eyes narrowed, but this could still be considered normal, just part of the plan. Then the blossom of the god tree closed and Madara knew there was a problem. Slowly the wood began to warp and contort, and before Madara's rapidly widening eyes the Shinju actually shrank away. It twisted and contracted as though caught in some giant version of Obito's Kamui. If Madara didn't know the wayward Uchiha was firmly unconscious, he might have actually suspected his student. However, after a moment of terseness, Madara knew this was something else, as the enormous form of the god tree dwindled away like a plant growing in reverse. There, standing resolutely in the crater the tree had made, a bright flaming haori of white chakra surrounding him, was Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto looked down at his hands, marveling at the strange cloak that hovered about his form. It didn't extend to his entire body like his normal Beiyu shroud, but just clung to him. It was warm and comforting, and just being in contact with it filled him with energy unlike anything he had ever experienced before. His hair was lifted away from his face by the pressure of the chakra surrounding him to reveal his Rinnegan, now red with 9 tomo swimming gently along the predetermined rings. He looked down at his right hand in particular, smiling as he saw the small white seed resting in his palm before nodding with determination and understanding. Then his eyes turned up. Madara and Naruto faced each other for a single inexplicable moment of tense silence, one seething with anger and hatred, the other a picture of calm determination. All at once the air around both seemed to explode as two objects, faster than most shinobi could even follow, sped towards one another, leaving rings of air in their wake. Earth-shattering ripples of displaced air rocked the ground and tore up the earth beneath them as punches and kicks were blocked and thrown with reckless abandon. Madara sneered as he realized the young boy hovering across from him was able to match him blow for blow, but had yet to retaliate or try an attack of his own. He shot back, black chakra bubbling off his shakuju to rocket through the air at the blonde. His surprise when said blonde simply caught the black balls was hard to describe. Naruto simply stared at the strange material energy with curiosity. It tried to eat into his skin and like it had a mind of its own, but it was heavily restrained by a perfectly formed sphere of gravity that Naruto would have found impossible to form so precisely and so quickly without the Shinju's help. It was as though his chakra was now water flowing through his coils, so easy to control it was almost thoughtless. It's a combination of elemental chakra. The revelation caused Madara's clenched fist to tighten. How was the boy able to discern that so quickly? And that wasn't even the most pressing question. What did you do to the Shinju? What happened to my eternal Tsukuyomi? Naruto seemed to ignore him though as the boy continued to scrutinize the ball of chakra in his hand, analyzing it with eyes that simply picked the world apart and laid it bare before him. 4 elemental chakra, which means if I do the same with a shift forward on the cycle, an almost identical sphere of black chakra appeared out of the blonde's hand, and when he placed them together they both simply disappeared, like they were never there. Madara, tired of being ignored and frustrated beyond belief, madly sent wave after wave of the black chakra at the hovering blonde, hoping to wipe the monk from existence, one excruciating part of his body at a time. However, Naruto simply raised his hand, a look of mild concentration crossing his features as the black orbs just vanished. That finally seemed to snap Madara out of it as he stared wide-eyed as one of the most powerful and unstoppable attacks he could create was effortlessly destroyed, again. Then Naruto was in front of him, a palm on his sea. The next moment he was in a crater on the ground larger than the one the Juubi had made when it fell. His sea was completely collapsed, and when Naruto gently touched down on the ground next to him, that infuriating haori of flaming chakra still surrounding his form, he could barely form words. How? Naruto stood over the defeated man, staring in silence for a good while, not quite sure what the man was asking. I created spheres of opposing elemental composition in the exact space yours took up, cancelling them out. Madara shook his head, finding the action difficult even as his body healed. It was useless though, he was at the Uzumaki's mercy right now. He could barely even control his chakra. And no, how did you, win? Naruto stared again, feeling a shred of pity enter his heart for this broken old man, disillusioned with the world to the point where he sought to make one of his own and drag the rest of humanity into it with him. You relied on your power alone, forcing others to help you where you could, like the Kyuubi and the Shinju. I let others help me, it gave me something to fight for, and in the end, I even let the Shinju help me. Madara now realized why the flaming coat of chakra seemed so familiar. It was the sign of a perfect Jinchuriki. Madara Uchiha had been defeated by a man that had done something even the Sage of the Six Paths himself could not. Somehow, it only seemed fitting, and that was his final thought as Naruto knelt down, a finger to his forehead as he felt all of his chakra drain away from his body. Naruto stood up slowly, suddenly feeling an awful lot heavier as the brilliant Haori of white flame dissipate from his body, the red in his Rinnegan be away and the Tomo fading. He briefly considered Madara's cold, still body as a long rod of black chakra formed in his hand. He tapped it on the ground once and the black seemed to melt away, leaving a perfectly ordinary wooden shakuju nestled in its place. He then quickly proceeded to lean on that as a wave of terrible exhaustion washed over him, nearly taking his feet out from under him. It was in that condition that he began his long walk back in the direction of a Megakure, feeling far too drained to consider a summon, or anything faster than a gentle amble. He had one, but he was tired. Right now he wanted nothing more to climb back into bed with the girl he loved and revel in her warmth. The words of the Shinju still echoed in his mind, but he felt he could put them aside for a night. He had a lifetime ahead of him with Madara and the Akatsuki behind him. He had a lifetime to find a peace mankind had been seeking for so long. But most importantly to him, he now had a lifetime to spend with the people he cared about. Because that was what he had chosen to fight for. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.